And hello, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to our webinar today on making room for conversations. I just want to thank you all for joining us, and Happy New Year and all those good things. Hope you had a good long holiday weekend. And I want to thank everyone for allowing me to serve as your president this year. I'm honored, I'm humbled, and I'm excited for all that we have to do this year and to lead our association. We have some great and lofty plans and goals for the year, and you will hear about them shortly as we have our upcoming meeting and planning session to discuss everything. I want to acknowledge first our wonderful NCJAR staff, led by our fearless CEO, Mary Kano, and our immediate past president, Jairo Rodriguez, for doing a great job in 2021 and for blessing me with the opportunity to get started in this difficult diversity, equity, and inclusion work last year. That was a big help to get me out of the gate faster this year. So thank you for that, Jairo. And many thanks to our diversity committee who helped me put this webinar together. Our chair, Wendy Worthy, our co-chair, Vanetta Hawkins. And we want to thank you all in your committee for your work, and we're going to be doing lots of more work this year. So thank you for that. Today's webinar is the next webinar in our diversity, equity, and inclusion series. In the early November, we had our first one on race and real estate, which is well received, and we will continue to have these throughout the year. In 2022, we will be partnering with all the local multicultural groups in their local chapters to help promote them and their agenda for the year. And we will be having some special events on each of their month celebrations. So we will be highlighting them during their months of celebration. So setting the stage for today's webinar, we're going to learn a whole lot of things today, but we're going to learn some more about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're going to get a different twist on fair housing than we got in the last webinar. And we're going to open up, discussion on having tough conversations which need to be had. So, I want to thank again our esteemed panelists for joining us, and let me introduce them. First, we're going to have Alexia Smokler, and she's from NAR, and she's going to be presenting on fair housing. She's the senior policy representative for fair housing at the National Association of Realtors. She manages NAR's positions on fair housing to Congress and federal agencies, and manages NAR's ACT initiative, promoting accountability, culture change, and training to advance fair housing in the industry. Before joining NAR, Alexia worked in fair housing enforcement at HUD on the staff of Congressman John Conyers and with nonprofit civil rights organizations. And introduction for Leslie Frazier is the Senior Vice President of Community and Industry Relations at Virginia Realtors. She leads their diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts and serves as the primary liaison between her association and the National Association of Realtors. And when I started doing all this work last year in August, the first person that I contacted that I was referred to by Fred Underwood at NAR was Leslie Frazier. So she will always be the first. And so we're going to segue into the session, and we're going to hopefully have a lot of conversations and discussion at the end. We have a lot of room at the end for conversations. And before we get started, I just wanted to announce my theme for 2022 as your president will be forward together. So let's move forward together, starting right now. And we're going to pass it over to Alexia. Take it away.
Thank you, Bill, for the invitation to speak with you this morning. Good morning, New Jersey. My name is Alexia Smokler, and as Bill mentioned, I'm the Senior Policy Representative for Fair Housing at NAR. My position is new. I'm part of a fair housing team at NAR that didn't exist 18 months ago. We've made fair housing a priority. As many of you know, that hasn't always been so. Like much of America, it's been a journey. But today in 2022, we believe the real estate industry has a special role to play in the fight for fair housing. We want homeownership to be available to the broadest possible group of qualified buyers. Not only is that good for the real estate industry, it's good for families and communities and our economy. And yet, the racial homeownership gap in America, a chasm of 30 points between African Americans and whites, it's virtually the same as it was 50 years ago before passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act, more than 50 years ago. And many of our communities are as racially segregated today as they were back then. We know that this gap in our divided communities, they're not just the natural consequences of people's individual choices. We acknowledge that our historic actions, along with those of government and financial institutions, helped to create that gap and enforce racial dividing lines. We acknowledge that there's a problem and we are committed to being part of the solution. That means taking a hard look at our own history and the systemic forces that are still at play in the housing market today because of it, that are continuing to keep millions of qualified buyers or nearly qualified buyers from attaining homeownership. So today I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the history that created artificial barriers to homeownership for Americans of color. I'm going to discuss with you the impact that it still has today, and then I'm going to tell you what we're doing about it. So just give me a moment here while I share my screen. All right, I'm hoping you all can see that because I can't see you anymore. So you know that the Fair Housing Act of 1968 made housing discrimination illegal. But before the Fair Housing Act, generations of buyers of color had been shut out of opportunities to build equity and pass it down through their families. And in many cases, when those families beat the odds and achieved homeownership, their communities were underinvested, so their properties were worth less. And sometimes their properties were even taken for projects like urban renewal and highway construction. The 1968 law didn't provide any remedy for all that history. So there's a lot of lost ground to make up for. And I'm sorry to say, we haven't done it yet. This is the racial homeownership gap. I hope you can see my mouse. This top line is the white homeownership rate in gray. In 2019, it was up to 73.4%. This blue line is the black homeownership rate. You can see this gap here, 20 points in 1940. It's actually bigger now than it was then, more than 30 points in 2019. So President Bill told me about a research project that some local historians have been doing, and hello, Pam, I know you're on the call today, about a community neighboring his town, Kramer Manor, which straddles Scotch Plains and Fanwood in Union County. Kramer Manor is a historically Black community of homeowners that is about to celebrate its 100th anniversary. Bill asked me to share the history of Kramer Manor with you, and I'm happy to do that because it illustrates every point I want to make today so that you can have context into the barriers we're still facing. So in 1924, a pair of Russian Jewish brothers who owned a New York City realty firm bought 51 acres of land in Union County. The Kramer brothers subdivided the land and sold lots averaging about 25 by 100 feet for about $250 to $300 each. The brothers actively marketed the development as a destination for Black families in what they called an ideal colored development. Why did they do that? Well, during the Great Migration of African Americans leaving the Jim Crow South, local governments in many Northern American cities decided they wanted to confine their new Black residents to specific designated neighborhoods, often located near industrial or other undesirable areas. So these governments passed racial zoning ordinances declaring who could live where in a city based on their race. Here's an example of a campaign for a racial zoning ordinance in St. Louis from 1916, and you can see that it says, "Look at these homes now, an entire block ruined by Negro invasion. Every house marked X, now occupied by Negroes. Save your home, vote for segregation." Now in 1917, the US Supreme Court struck down those local racial zoning laws. The court said that it was unconstitutional for a local government to deprive residents of their rights in this way. So people turned to private agreements to keep their neighborhoods white. They inserted racially restrictive covenants into property deeds to limit who an owner could sell or rent to based on that buyer or renter's race, nationality, or religion. These property developers, who are often realtors, built entire neighborhoods with the covenants written in. The example often cited is Levittown, New York, but there are many, many others. These covenants were attached to millions of deeds around the country. And if a property owner tried to sell their home to a non-white person, a white citizens group or a realtor group would sue either the seller or the buyer for violating the covenant. So first the racial zoning and then the restrictive covenants shut Black people out of many neighborhoods for decades. In most cities in the North, African Americans, including middle-class doctors, lawyers, and businessmen, found themselves living in overcrowded, overpriced, substandard housing because they weren't allowed to live anywhere else. So the Kramer brothers may have seen a business opportunity in offering suburban lots to Black people who wanted to own their own homes. And as one of their early ads said, stop paying rents. Now, by all accounts, the Kramers were not seeking to exploit this situation for their own profit, unlike some real estate operators at the time who sold land to Black families on predatory installment contracts that drained their wealth away. It appears that the Kramers were friendly with the residents for many decades and stayed involved with the community. And one of the Kramer brothers' daughters later married a Black man. So the Kramer brothers sought to sell land to Black buyers free from restrictions. Then they learned that redlining meant that their customers could not get mortgages. I expect most of you have heard of redlining. The federal government during and after the Great Depression wanted to boost home ownership. It would ensure loans if banks provided affordable, sustainable mortgages. Under the federal program, the FHA rated areas within communities for their perceived loan risk to advise financial institutions where to lend. Now, the early appraisal industry, which worked hand in glove with the predecessor of NAR, baked into its valuation model this unproven hypothesis that the very presence of Black people in a neighborhood would lower property values. These principles were incorporated into the FHA program, which you can see here. This is their underwriting manual from 1934, I believe, that says if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that properties shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy generally contributes to instability and a decline in values, and they encourage the use of restrictive covenants. These principles were also part of the Realtor Code of Ethics. Here you have our 1924 Code of Ethics, which aligns with that same view. This remained an NAR's code in some form through the 1950s. So the FHA produced color-coded residential security maps, advising lenders where to make loans. Banks were advised not to lend in a neighborhood where Black people or foreign-born immigrants lived. In New Jersey, the FHA issued these maps for Atlantic City, Bergen County, Camden, Essex County, Hudson County, Trenton, and Union County. So here's the map from Essex County. This here is Newark. This map was produced in 1939, and you can see the areas colored red. The descriptive text from one of these areas notes that it is 40% foreign-born Italians and 60% Negro. In this category for shifting or infiltration, it says that the area is increasing Negro. This area is rated D, 4th grade, and colored red. The FHA will not back a loan in this neighborhood. Under the federal policy from the 1930s until almost 1970, 98% of FHA loans went to white borrowers and white neighborhoods. This blue section on the map, that's where the money went. In cities across America, the federal government subsidized home ownership for white people while withholding that same aid for African Americans and certain immigrants. Now, this policy infuriated and frustrated Harry Kramer. He had put together loan applications for about a dozen of his buyers in Kramer Manor and had approached 2 different banks to secure loans. Both times he was told that even though every one of his applicants had excellent credit, there could be no FHA approval for loans in a Black development. In 1941, Harry Kramer even wrote to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, telling him this story and pleading for help. Without loans, the early residents of Kramer Manor banded together to build their own homes. The city provided no running water, no roads, or storm sewers. The residents worked summers and weekends to dig artesian wells, build roads, dig surface drainage, and fill in lowlands and swamps. In 1961, the local government in Scotch Plains designated Kramer Manor as blighted and applied for federal funds to study an urban renewal project that would tear down the homes in Kramer Manor and remove the families. The lack of infrastructure, which of course the local government had denied, was cited as one basis for this decision. Kramer Manor residents organized in collaboration with the Plainfield NAACP to defend the community they had built. The federal urban renewal plan eventually failed because of a lack of replacement housing in the community for the Kramer Manor residents who would have been forced out. The residents strongly opposed the public housing option that was offered to them. Now, across the country from the 1950s to the 1970s, local governments used federal funds and eminent domain to take Black homeowners and business owners' property for urban renewal, typically paying them only a pittance in reimbursement. Federal subsidies went to urban renewal programs in more than 400 localities, displaced at least 300,000 families, about 1.2 million Americans. While Black Americans were just 13% of the total population in 1960, they were about 55% of those who were displaced. Other communities were not able to wage or win this fight the way Kramer Manor did. Here's what James Baldwin had to say about urban renewal in San Francisco in 1963. All right, here we go.
A boy last week who was 16 in San Francisco told me on television, thank God we got him to talk. Maybe somebody will start to listen. He said, I got no country, I've got no flag. Now he's only 16 years old. And I couldn't say you do. I don't have any evidence to prove that he does. They were tearing down his house because San Francisco is engaging, as most northern cities now are engaged, in something called urban renewal, which means moving the Negroes out. It means Negro removal. That is what it means. And the federal government is an accomplice to this fact. Now we're talking about human beings. There's not such a thing as a monolithic wall or some abstraction called the Negro problem. These Negro boys and girls who at 16 and 17 don't believe the country means anything that it says, don't feel they have any place here on the basis of the performance of the entire country.
But now, Jim...
No, am I exaggerating?
No, I certainly could not say that you're exaggerating.
So what does all this history mean for African Americans who want to buy homes today? That historical inability to build equity and pass down intergenerational wealth means that, according to NAR's research, white families are more than twice as likely as Black families to be able to rely on the sale of an existing home for their down payment. Our research shows that Black households are more than 3 times as likely as white households to have to tap a 401k for their down payment. Black households are more than twice as likely as white households to have student loan debt, and they have more. Today's system of vetting mortgages reflects the weight of this history. That inability to build wealth, along with discrimination in education and labor market, means that African Americans are more than twice as likely as white Americans to be rejected for a mortgage. When African Americans attain home ownership, they pay a higher interest rate. Studies show they pay more in mortgage insurance, fees, and taxes. Now, at NAR, we believe that in order to create a thriving housing market, we have to acknowledge these barriers and look for solutions. So what are we doing about it? Here in Washington, we're working on policy solutions with a coalition of industry and housing advocates that include NAREB, the Mortgage Bankers Association, the National Fair Housing Alliance, the Urban League, the NAACP, and others. It's called the Black Homeownership Collaborative. And you can find its 7-point plan, which we largely endorse, at 3by30.org. It includes things like down payment assistance, homeownership counseling, improved access to credit, and so on. We are advocating for these initiatives in Washington. NAR has also launched a suite of fair housing resources for members, associations, and brokerages as a part of our ACT Fair Housing Initiative. ACT is an acronym. It stands for Accountability, Culture Change, and Training. It's a package of industry reforms and tools for members, brokerages, and associations, shoring up our own house. The most important pillar of ACT is accountability. As one of his first acts as 2021 NAR president, Charlie Oppler apologized for our shameful role in this history. Now, an apology is a start, but it's not nearly enough. We've also launched a self-testing program for brokerages who want to voluntarily examine themselves for discrimination. This will allow a brokerage to uncover and address problems confidentially before a newspaper or a private fair housing group does. Also on the accountability front, we've reviewed the real estate licensure laws of all 50 states. There is great variability among the states when it comes to fair housing education and discipline for licensees. Some states have very little. We've shared a set of best practices in licensure with our state associations so that we can push to hold ourselves to the highest standard. Also here in Washington, we advocate for increased funding for fair housing enforcement at my former place of work, HUD's Office of Fair Housing, including increased funding for testing. Fair housing violations shouldn't be treated any differently than any other unethical or unprofessional behavior. We encourage enforcement, we don't tolerate it. Now, the next two prongs of ACT, culture change and training, work in tandem with each other. We want to acknowledge and lift up realtors who are fair housing leaders to ensure our industry culture is one that applauds and celebrates fair housing. We're very excited about a video series we've launched of realtor fair housing champions who embrace fair housing as part of their business strategy. I'd like to share one of these short videos with you now. This is Courtney James of Durham, North Carolina, who is being the change.
When I first started in real estate, other agents at my firm didn't want to show buyers property near downtown Durham because they considered it to be a dangerous place. Downtown Durham probably has the highest population of people of color. I decided to start Urban Durham because I wanted a place that felt like it was invested in the community. And one of the things that we did from the day we opened our doors is we have a policy where for every transaction that's closed, we have that agent make a donation to a local nonprofit. Marcelle Thomas joined Urban Durham a few years ago, and from the moment she walked into our office, she has been bringing us amazing projects to work on, and we love her for it.
I work with a lot of first-time homebuyers, many whom are minority. Everything from going to classes on improving their credit to going to the self-help credit union.
One of the biggest obstacles for buyers is coming up with cash for closing. We really wanted our 2021 fundraising goal to be about helping to reduce the racial homeownership gap. And we are going to partner with the National Association of Real Estate Brokers to help provide closing cost loans for Black home buyers in the Durham area. We are worse off now in terms of the Black-white racial homeownership disparity than we were 50 years ago. And a lot of that is due to the 2008 subprime loans, where Black homeowners were twice as likely as white homeowners to have a subprime loan, meaning that they were disproportionately at risk for losing their home. Once people have this asset of their home, we feel firmly that not to sell the house is the right choice in many cases. But it can be really hard to keep up their home.
And there are so many people in that position, so many people.
Marcel introduced me to Jessica Barnes, a single mom with 2 kids who inherited her home from her father.
Her father was too ill to maintain the home anymore, and literally everything was broken.
So we essentially completely gutted the house and renovated it. We probably had bit off more than we could chew because we are not in the construction business, but the home was fabulous after. We care a lot about fair housing, and I think that that shows in our values, and it does earn us a lot of business because people care a lot about that.
Inspiring content, right? We'll soon be announcing additional ways to acknowledge our Realtor Fair Housing champions. Also in culture change, we've launched a fair housing themed consumer ad campaign so members can show the public their commitment. We're also introducing new and innovative training opportunities for realtors. In November of 2020, we launched Fairhaven, an interactive fair housing training that takes you through realistic scenarios where discrimination may occur in a real estate transaction. It also puts you in the shoes of a client on the receiving end of discrimination. It's a free member benefit and it's available at fairhaven.realtor. It takes about an hour to an hour and a half to complete. Also in 2020, we released a training video on implicit bias in real estate, which is available on our website. And this spring, we're launching a 3-hour classroom course on implicit bias that will qualify for CE credit. This course will their ability to serve all consumers equally. So that was a lot. As I wrap up, I'll share with you one of my favorite quotes from the author, William Faulkner. Faulkner said, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." That helps us be better community leaders and to create a thriving real estate market that serves everyone. I'm turning it back over to Bill now. Bill, back over to you. Or is it Leslie? I'm not sure. Uh-oh, Bill, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great. Sorry about that. Yeah, thanks, Alexia. You were great. You gave us a lot of great insight. And, I was happy to share the local story, which is hard to believe here in Scotch Plains, Fanwood, suburban Union County, the issues that, were right down the street from me not too long ago. So with that, we're going to switch over and pass the baton on to Leslie Frazier, our second segment host, and she will take it away.
Thank you, President Flagg. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Super stoked that I get to tag team with Alexia. Gotten really to know her a lot over the past year, and I'm so glad that the National Association has her. So she shared a lot of information, right? There's a lot to unpack with that. I think that when it comes to learning so much about the history of not only our industry, but just kind of housing and a lot of discriminatory practices in general, it can be overwhelming. I purchased my first house in 2019 in a neighborhood that is the it neighborhood in Richmond, Virginia. Everyone is moving there. But when I looked at a lot of the history of my neighborhood, I saw that I'm in a red line neighborhood. So it's just kind of fascinating to see the changes over the decades. So how do we unpack all of this? And a key portion of this is going to be just having those difficult conversations. My presentation is titled that around race or any differences. I will focus a lot of my examples through a racial lens today, but honestly, the steps that I'll go into could really help anyone have any kind of difficult conversation. So just kind of looking at expectations and wishes for today, in order for difficult conversations to happen, a safe space has to be created. In talking with President Flagg, especially with the theme of Forward Together, creating a space and platform like this where you can share different things and different experiences is key in moving forward. I know many, if not all of you, have heard about diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, but I'll do a quick recap on what they are. I'll go into the steps on how to have difficult conversations. And then once we do that, talk about how we can be change agents and then kick it over to questions. So I want everyone to look at this screen. These puzzle pieces represent a lot of different elements of diversity. Of course, we often talk about race, but age, religion, experiences, thought processes. I mean, there's so many different elements. But for them to work, for inclusion to happen, you really have to put the pieces of the puzzle together. But this quote from Verna Myers is my favorite way to talk about diversity and inclusion. Diversity is being invited to the party, and inclusion is being asked to dance. It makes me think back to high school prom or homecoming. If you attended the dance, but you were a wallflower the whole night, you were there, but you really didn't get the full experience of everything that was happening. Whereas if someone invited you on the dance floor and you danced the night away, you probably went home and told your folks, man, this was the best time of my life. So people who are proponents of diversity and inclusion really just wanted to be invited to the party and asked to dance. But the E portion of DEI is equity, and it's really key component to our discussion. I often talk to people and they get equity confused with equality, so I'll just quickly distinguish the two. The image on the left shows equality, which is giving everyone the same thing. And it seems fair in theory, but it really only works if everyone is at the same place to begin with. And as you can see, the folks on the screen have different heights, different abilities, so giving them the same size box does not allow them all to see the game. Whereas equity on the right is giving everyone access to the same opportunities. So it doesn't matter where you start, your abilities, your background, everyone is now able to see the game. So I'm going to kick it over into some steps to how to have difficult conversations. But before we do that, have a quick poll. You all will see it pop up on your screen, but I'm just curious at the present moment, how do you feel, true or false? I feel well practiced in having difficult conversations. All right, it's looking like most kind of feel like they do, or leaning towards 50-50 a little bit. Give a few more seconds for folks to fill out the poll. All right, almost 50-50, slightly more folks kind of feel like they're well practiced in it, but pretty 50-50. So I'll answer it. I'll let you all know. I feel I would raise my hand halfway on that. You can talk about how to have difficult conversations all day, but they really vary based on the situation you're in, right? So hopefully these steps that I'll go over will help you feel more practiced in having difficult conversations. So the first one is just be open. I think when it comes to a difficult topic, especially about race or age or gender, we worry too much about walking on eggshells. And if you worry too much about walking on eggshells, you probably will. So take the time and just lean in with a genuine attitude and willingness to learn. Come to the conversation with curiosity. Focus on what you're hearing, not what you'll say next. I grew up in Virginia in the South. You know, the elders in my family would always say, you know, there's a reason why God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. You're supposed to listen more than you speak. And I think often with difficult conversations, people worry so much about what they'll say next or how they'll respond that those thought processes totally hijack the conversation. And oftentimes we miss out on what we're actually hearing. And of course, make sure you check your biases. Alexia mentioned that NAR's put out an implicit bias video, which if you have not viewed that, I highly encourage that you do. It's very helpful in learning what, subconsciously and unconsciously we have going on in our brain. But it's the only way to truly be open if you check your biases at the door. The second step is acknowledging and validating. You know, you can't talk about an issue and move the needle until you acknowledge that it exists. I've read The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, and Alexia's presentation was just so great, talking about just a fraction of a lot of the historical inequities that have happened. And we really can't move forward and have a conversation about these things until you acknowledge that, yeah, that really did happen. I think it's easy for us, as most of us were not even around when a lot of that happened, to not be able to see it or not be able to grasp it. But we have to learn our history first and then be able to talk about it. And you have to respect others' points of view, no matter how different they may be, or no matter how hard it is for you to understand it because you yourself have not experienced it. I'll give an example. I used to serve on the Virginia board for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And one of my fellow board members was transgender, and we were about 10 years apart in age. I was older than he was. And I had never worked with or honestly really met anyone who was transgender before that experience. And we were able to just have a conversation, and I was just genuinely curious. I wanted to make sure I respected him and didn't say anything that I may have thought was a good intention, but it was actually offensive. And I was able to really learn a lot from that. And had we not developed a relationship to where we could have that back and forth dialogue, I would have not learned anywhere near as much as I did. So just a quick self-reflection question. We won't do a poll for this one. Just think about it. When is the last time you talked with someone of a completely different perspective? Were you all able to respect each other? Moving on into step 3 is being understanding. You know, it can be really hard to understand someone else's experiences if you haven't experienced it yourself, but do your best to put yourself in the other person's shoes. You know, envisioning what someone else is going through will help you better understand it. And you have to practice being a good listener. You know, I talked about this earlier in step 1, but in trying to understand someone else's perspective, you have to listen to him, her, they, and let them share their perspective, and you limit your own talking. And you have to actively listen, not just once, but you have to make it a constant habit. So the 4th step is be diverse and inclusive in your discussions. You know, talking to people who are just like you really gets you nowhere. You know, if I only talk to Black people about race, or I only talk to my fellow millennials, I wouldn't really get very far. You know, in many ways, I'd just be preaching to the choir. So same for you all. You know, talk to someone of a different age from a different part of the country or another country than you are, and be able to ask open-ended questions where they can provide insight. You know, ask about their experiences with bias, exclusion. Ask if there was a time when they were included and it made them feel better or more successful. And by doing this, you can get a better understanding of how you yourself can foster inclusion, which is the ultimate goal here. Step number 5, you know, find the things you have in common. We all have differences, race, age, gender, you know, length of time in the business that all make us different, sure. But at the end of the day, we're human beings. We have a lot more in common than not. You know, ask people genuinely about themselves and their interests. You know, you may find out that you all like the same show or have the same favorite actor. You know, it can make talking about something difficult easier to move forward when you find the things that you have in common. And the last formal step, you know, I'm sure we've all heard this growing up. It's not always what you say, but how you say it. This definitely applies everywhere. But when you talk about a sensitive topic like race, your tone and your approach is key. You know, a negative attitude can make something fall on deaf ears. You may be super passionate about an issue and have some great points. But if you come across angry or super critical of someone else, then it's hard for them to understand what you're saying or even, quite frankly, want to hear it. but don't sugarcoat things so much that you can't actually have a meaningful conversation. But also be mindful of your words and don't be afraid. So I'll give an example. Some people may think that Black people are often quick to talk about slavery or bring it up, and that, you know, it's time to move on past that issue. Well, instead of saying, I don't get why you people always bring up slavery, it ended over 150 years ago, isn't it time to move on? You know, say, hey, you know, I've often heard Black people talk about slavery. I know it ended over 150 years ago, but it's still very much a trigger for some. Could you shed some light on that? I want to understand. The former scenario, if someone said that to me, I would not even engage in a conversation. It very much seems like that person's mind is made up and they would not be open to any insight or learning. But the latter situation, someone approaching a conversation with curiosity and a genuine willingness to learn and understand, I would absolutely have a conversation about it. You know, I'd probably say, good question. You know, I, as a lighter skinned mixed race woman, back during the slavery times would have been in the house. I would have been treated better for being lighter skinned. Whereas some of my darker skinned friends and colleagues would have worked out in the field. And a lot of that inequity just within the Black race still impacts people today. You know, it makes me think, if you injure yourself, you know, the injury, scraping your knee, breaking a bone happens in an instant, but the recovery process takes time. Same with this instance of slavery, same with a lot of the historical inequities that Alexia mentioned. You know, it's going to take time to heal, but it definitely starts with where we are now, you know, seeking to understand and having these real life meaningful conversations. And related to that, while this is not a formal step in how to have difficult conversations, I just want to mention why the phrase, I don't see color, can be offensive. You know, a lot of people, I know I feel this way when I hear that phrase. I kind of feel like, well, if you don't see color, you don't see me, and you don't see a lot of maybe historical inequities around race that are still relevant today. So next time, you know, try telling someone, hey, I see you, and I want to learn more about you and your differences. All right, so we talked about a lot. We've done a recap on DEI. We've gone over some steps of how to have difficult conversations. So what do we do with that? Well, the ultimate goal is to become allies and agents of change. So I have 3 quick steps around that for you all. The first one is to ask questions, don't assume. I used to work with a lot of veterans in the military, and one of the senior officers I worked with used to always tell me, Leslie, when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me. So we can't assume that things that we're saying to someone who may be different from us, you know, while we have good intentions, is the right thing to say. For example, you know, I have people who ask me a lot, you know, do I say Black or African American? I personally say Black. Most people I know say Black as opposed to African American, as it's more inclusive, but ask someone at the end of the day. People will let you know what they want to be called. These efforts have to be intentional. We can't just do this year. We can't just do this, you know, during the pandemic, because one day the pandemic will be over. But we have to keep practicing this today, tomorrow, and moving forward. It has to be embedded intentionally in our culture. And the last thing I want to leave you with is, this is a marathon, not a sprint. You know, all of the slides that Alexia showed, documenting a lot of the historical inequities, that didn't happen over time. So the solutions aren't going to happen over time. But we have to move forward together every day in order to get to the next level, in order for us to change as a culture. So I just want to quickly do another poll. There is no right or wrong answer for this, but true or false, I now feel better equipped to have difficult conversations. And of course, you know, it really, you can be on a PowerPoint all day, you can talk about it, but until you're kind of faced with those nuances, it's difficult. But try and remember the basic steps, and at the end of the day, how we're all human beings and we all have our own perspectives to share. All right. Seems like most of you feel better equipped. And I just want to leave you all with this quote before I kick it back to President Flagg. You know, it's by one of my favorite rappers, the late Nipsey Hussle, but instead of trying to build a brick wall, lay a brick every day. Eventually you'll look up and you'll have a brick wall. You know, these efforts around DEI, around understanding the role that our industry has played in housing discrimination, or in general, how we can move forward and be better with our clients. It's going to take time, But if you lay one thing brick by brick, before you know it, you'll have a brick wall. President Flagg, I'll kick it back over to you.
Okay, Leslie, thank you very much. You did a great job. And thank you to Alexia and Leslie. And we're gonna move on to the Q&A. And to start things off, I'm gonna ask the first question. I hope all of you got something out of this, and I would like a lot of participation and questions from the attendees. So I'm gonna start off the questions with how does making ourselves more diverse, equitable, and inclusive help us better serve our diverse clients and the public? So you both can take a stab at that one.
Sure, I'll kick it off. I mean, quite frankly, different perspectives make you better, period, right? It makes you more relatable. It makes you more approachable. It makes you more knowledgeable. And I'll give an example. I grew up in a military community and at the beach. And then when I went to college, it was 24% international. It was in the mountains. It was relatively rural. Very different perspectives, but learning kind of geographical difference just made me better. And I ultimately worked in government, which helped me relate more with constituents. You know, I worked in government, like I said, before joining the realtor world. I've only been in this family since September 2020, but kind of having those different perspectives, having done kind of policy work and having traveled kind of all around the state and then coming into this role, I think it equipped me in ways that I never realized. So your clients and your potential clients, especially in the communities you all serve, are extremely diverse. And you are helping them make a major decision, especially if it's their first time purchasing a house. So you need to be able to relate to them and respect and understand their needs. So DEI definitely helps in that boat.
I don't have a whole lot to add to Leslie's excellent answer, except to say, you know, Fortune 500 companies and universities acknowledge that having a diverse group of students, a diverse workforce, as Leslie said, makes us better, because when you're in a room like with folks who are just like yourself, you know, there's a tendency to fall into groupthink where we all have the same experiences. We're all reinforcing each other. Nobody's questioning things. You know, our critical thinking skills are improved when we're around people who are different from ourselves. It forces us to question our assumptions and look at things in a different way. And when we are serving the public, we need to be able to draw on these different viewpoints so that we can serve all the different people out there who want to buy a house.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. The next question, related to the first question, how does being more diverse, equitable, and inclusive help businesses and broader the economy?
I'll take a crack at this one, and I actually have some data to share with you guys on this. So the white homeownership rate, it's very high. It's been boosted, and I didn't tell you in my presentation about all the other ways it's been boosted by the government. Economists are not sure how much higher it can go. Homeownership growth in the last decade has been driven by Hispanics, and that trend is predicted to continue. So here's a link to some data on that. So we have to be open to serving everyone to improve and to keep growing our businesses. But more broadly, when some people are held back from the benefits of homeownership and from building wealth and passing that wealth down, it stifles economic growth. It shrinks the size of the pie for everybody. So the Fed, Morgan Stanley, Citigroup, Moody's Analytics have all published studies showing how discrimination and segregation, they shrink the economy and they keep qualified buyers out of homes and limit job creation. So here's a couple of links to some of those studies where you can see that fighting discrimination, it's not just about helping disadvantaged people. We all benefit when everyone has access. Those benefits are compounded for everyone.
Yeah, Alexia is spot on. I think the fact that there's so much data on this now shows, you know, we're not just making this up. This is key, and there's a lot of just factual evidence behind it. Also, DEI, I mean, other than just really being the right thing to do, it's not just good for business, it's essential to business. I think about this pandemic, if we didn't all adapt and change and be more creative in how we do business, we wouldn't still be around. And the businesses that have been around for decades, if they didn't change, if they didn't welcome new perspectives, new technologies, they wouldn't be around. And with the growing population, U.S. Census data says the U.S. will be majority minority in a couple of decades. We don't need to be reactionary to it. We need to be proactive, and that time is now.
Okay, and the last question I have is, we've made some major strides the last couple of years, but what specific resources are now available to associations and members around DE&I and fair housing?
I can jump in first with some of our NAR resources. So I mentioned our implicit bias video. I'm posting a link in the chat box to that video. This teaches you about how your unconscious brain, often without you being aware of it, associates certain groups of people with stereotypes. And actually, residential segregation makes this problem worse because the stereotypes are related to people that you don't really know. So you're getting these ideas from media and culture, and they're not true. When you actually interact with diverse group of people in your daily life, your bias towards those groups goes down. Now, following up on this video, we're launching, as I mentioned, a 3-hour classroom course that'll be available for CE credit. And I'm going to talk to your staff about bringing that course to your association. Then I want to post a link to you for Fairhaven. This is our simulation training that puts you in realistic scenarios where you have to make choices, and your choices will affect the outcome dealing with discrimination in a real estate transaction. When we created this, we looked at real fair housing cases and real FAQs for members about situations that they needed advice on or weren't sure how to confront. Also, in a very different twist, which I don't think you'll see in any other fair housing training, we put you in the shoes of a person who's experienced housing discrimination and include video testimonials from real people who have experienced housing discrimination to give you that emotional impact and that empathy for folks, to see that this affects real people's lives. And the feedback we've gotten, it's people have become tearful, they've become angry, and they've really redoubled their commitment to doing the right thing by their clients. I got one more resource for you now. This is our Brokerage Essentials Fair Housing chapter. Now, this is just basic fair housing compliance. These are the policies and procedures you want to have in place so that you don't get sued. Okay, this is the minimum that you can do to protect yourself from liability. We encourage everyone to do more, And then finally, just a link to our fair housing homepage where we're constantly adding new material and new assets. Stay tuned, that we've got a lot more irons in the fire and a lot more things coming.
Yeah, just to echo all the great resources that Alexia mentioned, NAR is really serious about this and have put out so many wonderful trainings and tools. I have to talk about Fairhaven. So full transparency, while I have the attention span of a 5-year-old, I cannot sit through long trainings, and Fairhaven was quick. I did it in an hour, including having failed a simulation, which I failed the simulation where my client was disabled, which I grew up with a disabled father. So I was pretty embarrassed about that, but it was such a learning opportunity. It's almost it's a simulation, but it's almost kind of like a game that really takes you through different scenarios and you learn so much. Our immediate past president did Fairhaven and said, we've got to issue a challenge to all of our members around this. And we did. We kind of created a competition amongst our local associations, and we awarded the top 5 with the highest percentage of Fairhaven completion, kind of a small prize and recognition. But even then, the overall Fairhaven numbers are lower than they should be. So I encourage all of you, if you have not taken Fairhaven, or even if you have and want to get a different perspective again, to do it. It is a wonderful training, and it does not take much time at all. Also, some things that we did at Virginia Realtors, coming on board, we recognized, okay, our members don't really look like the populations they serve, and our leadership really doesn't look like our members and the populations we serve. So when we did our committee and board applications last year, we put out some videos and some testimonials of members who currently serve from diverse backgrounds, different ages, races, all over the state. And they all talked about why they served. And I think that image, the realtor who's been involved maybe at her local association for 5 or 10 years and has thought about getting involved at the state level but didn't, seeing someone that probably looks like them or someone of the same age or the same background and experience, that representation was key. And we had a 50% increase in our committee applications. And I really think it was solely as a result of those videos and testimonials, because we were showing that we were inclusive and wanted even more perspectives in leadership roles in our association. And we had our leadership summit last week, and pretty much everyone who applied was there. And I'm walking around the room, meeting people, brand new, know nothing about, volunteering, but we're just excited to be there. And then those who had been around for ages. And I see those who have been around showing the younger and newer ones the ropes. And it was beautiful. That's exactly what we want to see. So these are some small things that NCJAR can do as well. And I will put Virginia Realtors DEI webpage in the chat as well. We've got quite a few resources there. I know we in Virginia see ourselves as kind of the bridge between national and our locals. And I know the New Jersey Association has been working that way as well. So definitely encourage that you all check out those resources and bring someone along to the next event.
Okay, we did have one question in the chat, and I guess this would be addressed to you, Alexia. Question is from Financial GPS for me. You mentioned properties were taken by developers with the assistance of the government. Being that laws had changed, but government still allowed for those properties to be taken, what are the changes government is affecting to avoid the same thing to happen?
Well, an example I didn't talk about was highway construction. And, in the 50s and 60s, when we built the interstate highway system, that also displaced about 1 million people. And those highways were routed often through Black communities. And with the new infrastructure bill coming out, some concerns have been raised that we need to be careful that this doesn't happen again, because the money gets dispersed by the federal government, but it's the local communities that draw up the plans and decide where the highways will be routed. I think you could probably make a Fair Housing Act challenge if a highway is having a disparate impact on folks based on their color. Yeah, I think there might be some legal protection. I know that in Texas, a highway development was halted by the federal government because they said that it was going to disproportionately impact people of color. Now, that was Joseph Biden's Department of Justice. Would a different Department of Justice bring that case? Probably not. So there are some protections in place, but that we still have to fight and use those laws to fight and protect ourselves and our communities.
And if I may piggyback on that, I used to work in state government, so we'd work a lot with federal and local. And federal government, does so much, but it's also slow moving. I encourage you all to get involved with public policy, give to RPAC, know what's going on and where the money is going so that you can have a voice. Because at the end of the day, kind of all politics is local, and so many of policies in place are really at the local level and can be changed much quicker that way, but they tend to be the ones that we know the least about. So I definitely encourage you all to get involved that way.
That was a great commercial for RPAC. We love RPAC and we need to support RPAC, but you just got another example of why RPAC is important. We have another question from David Weisbrod. Do all state associations have a DE&I contact?
Hey, David, so the answer is no, but I see that growing all the time. Like, I'm a part of an informal but becoming more formalized cohort of my counterparts in other states, and we've been meeting regularly, and I've noticed that our attendees are starting to increase. I think for most state associations, there's someone on staff who has also absorbed a lot of the DEI role. Virginia is a little unique in that my position was created and in a senior level to do this, but I see other states kind of doing that as well, and some of the larger local associations. But in general, I see DEI and fair housing being more embedded into kind of the fabric of our associations, which is great. That's much needed change.
And Alexia, a follow-up question by David. Can NAR require it?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer, but I'm going to look into it, David, and you can follow up with me after if you'd like.
Yeah, David, if you're asking, can NAR require that all state associations have a DEI person? I doubt it, just because of the budgets. I don't know the different budgets across from state to state, but I think every state should have a commitment to DEI. Every local association should have a commitment to DEI, modeling a lot of what NAR has done. But I think a lot of that comes with just the education and the work towards the culture change.
And we have a DEI contact at NAR. His name is Ryan Davis. You can always reach out to him and see what kind of resources you can leverage from us.
Yes, Ryan is great. I actually had a nice conversation with him on Friday, and he's the new Fred Underwood, and he's got to stop saying he's the new Fred Underwood. He's the new Ryan Davis. So I don't see any other questions, but we have so many resources in the chat, and I'm sure Crystal is going to do something behind the scenes to put this on the NCJAR website and make sure that everybody has access to the recording when it's available. So I want to thank you all again for attending, and I want to thank our presenters, Leslie and Alexia, for doing a great job. And we're excited and looking forward to our next event in the series. And we're going to keep this going. The conversations are not going to end today. We're going to keep the conversations going, and we're going to keep on keeping on and doing the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiative in 2022. So Crystal, you're going to do a poll. You can do a poll. Before we end, we're going to take a poll and answer the question again. Would you participate in the focus group to further the conversation? Because we need to keep this going, and we can't keep it going unless we have some people in the focus group.
Thank you, President Flagg. I put my contact information in the chat too, if anyone has any questions, and I put NAR's diversity page as well. I know people tend to talk about DEI and fair housing almost one and the same. I've been guilty of that, but there's great resources on the diversity side as well.
Well, hopefully the poll is being taken, and it looks like it's an overwhelming yes. So far, it's looking like a very strong yes. So that means that this presentation did something. It touched people's hearts, and it is going to allow this conversation to continue. So that's a great thing. Okay, so unless anyone has anything else, I want to thank you so much again for joining, and I look forward to talking to you soon, and have a great day and the rest of your week. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.